The Lord be with you. I know it probably seems strange having me stare at you from the other side of a screen. And for those of you who know me even partially intimately, you know this is not something that I would do under normal circumstances. So these must not be normal circumstances. And that is exactly it. We are at a time when we have been working more and more with restrictions that have been given to us both for health reasons and for governmental reasons. And we finally gotten ourselves into a situation where it's kind of impossible to have face-to-face meetings for an indeterminate amount of time. So our goal is to still offer some spiritual resources to you. We want to give some in text form for those of you who like to read. There will be some prayer and meditations in text form. There will be some morning prayers and evening prayers sent through emails in text form. But for those of you who are a little more visual in nature, we're going to offer some videos a few times a week. Unfortunately, they won't be very stimulating videos. They will certainly just be talking head type videos. But our goal is still to try and connect spiritually and to have a little bit of opportunity for us to look at God's Word and to meditate upon the times in which we find ourselves. So for this first video, what I would like to focus on is the season of Lent itself. Lent is a very special time of year, and it strikes me that this particular pandemic struck, at least in our North American context, not in the throes of summer, not in the deep, dark heart of winter, but it came close to spring, which means for those of us who follow the liturgical year, it comes in the season of Lent, which is fascinating because Lent in and of itself is a season of barrenness, a season of wilderness, a season where we are sort of forced into certain restrictions and limitations. The three foundational pillars of Lent are prayer and almsgiving and fasting. So we are supposed to be a little more focused on intense times of prayer during this season. Our giving is supposed to go more towards charitable things. So resources that would normally be directed inwardly at us are now directed outwardly towards those who are more in need. And then this is a time of fasting, not of feasting. A time when we limit ourselves, where we refrain from eating certain things. Some of us change certain habits. We give up certain rhythms of life for a period of time. And my estimation is that we in the North American church are probably not very good at the season of Lent. And I think that's because we've become such creatures of comfort. We depend upon lots of routines. We depend upon lots of things. So when we are told to self-limit, it doesn't come very naturally for us. So how interesting that now, during this season, we have limitations that have been put upon us. We have been restricted both from the government, from the health community, as well as just from sometimes our own personal needs and our own personal fears and phobias. We have been forced into a situation where we have to limit. And I can't help but wonder if this is our God inviting us into a deeper Lenten experience. When all things are stripped away, and we don't have the typical comforts and the typical rhythms to lean upon or to identify with for our daily rhythms, we're forced to sit in a vulnerable state with God and just to spend time with Him, to meditate upon Him and His ability to provide, His sufficiency, and even our identity in him. Our identity isn't in this other stuff. It's in God. So the text that I want to look at today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, the first 11 verses, which say, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, 'If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread.' Jesus answered, 'It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God.' Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. 'If you are the Son of God,' he said, 'throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone.' Jesus answered him, 'It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test.' Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. 'All this I will give you,' he said, 'if you will bow down and worship me.' Jesus said to him, 'Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only.' Then the devil left him, and the angels came and attended him." These are the very words of our eternal God. Now, some things stand out to me from this reading, particularly as it relates to the situation that we now find ourselves in. And the first thing is the fact that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. In other words, the wilderness wasn't Jesus' natural destination. It wasn't where he intended to go. He had his own comforts, his own rhythms to life, and yet it was God's Spirit that wanted him to go to a barren place of restriction for God's own purposes. And Jesus was willing to follow God's Spirit wherever it wanted to lead him. And I think that's a good reminder for us today. Again, we may not choose to be in this barren, restricted time, but God's Spirit could be leading us into some things that we need to be open to and we need to be sensitive to. And then Jesus is tested by this enemy of God. And in the tests, he goes back and he quotes from these passages in the book of Deuteronomy, which in and of itself is a book about wilderness wanderings. And each test, I think, speaks a little bit to our situation. You know, the first test is about bread or hunger or our physical needs that we have. And I can't help but notice in this time how much hoarding we do when we're fearful. We hoard toilet paper, we hoard cleaning supplies, we hoard food without much thought of what other people need or how this affects the greater community. We only become concerned about ourselves and very inwardly focused. And yet, Jesus teaches us that the goal is not to focus solely or even primarily on our physical needs, but on the words of God, that spiritual truth and healing and comfort and feeding that we get from God, which is life itself. It is more important than our physical needs and our desires. The second test, at least as far as Matthew's gospel is concerned, has to do with the holy place or the temple. And I can't help but think how much disruption the church has had during this time. We want to meet together. We want to have these regular Sunday gatherings, which we are used to. And we're in a time where we can't have them. It would be very easy to be tempted to think that somehow now we are distant from God because we can't gather in the way that we normally do. But we need to remember the truth that God's Spirit is with Jesus even in the wilderness, even when he's not in the holy place, when he's not at the temple. And God's Spirit is with us as well when we can't gather as a group in a church setting. And then the third test has to do with all of the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And I can't help but wonder how many of us are willing to give up anything just to get this pandemic over with, to have these restrictions lifted, because we want to get back to all those creaturely comforts. We want to get back to all of the things that we have lost because we have begun to identify with those things. We see those things as who we are and what we desire most. And I can't help but wonder if we're being taught in this wilderness season that we are to worship the Lord our God and serve him only. God comes first in all things. Even when we have access to all of the modern technology, all of the modern comforts of this Western world, God still needs to be our primary love. Now, during the summer, we did a series of meditations in the first 8 Psalms. And Psalm 4 was a psalm about trusting in God in the nighttime when all of these fears and uncertainties surround us, being able to rest in the Lord. And we sort of coined a phrase back then as a sort of a call and response. In the nighttime, the peace of God. The idea was, may the peace of God be with you, even in those darkest moments in your life. What I would like to do, especially during these seasons of quarantine, is to tweak that phrase a little bit for our present situation and to start saying, in our isolation, the peace of God. And that is my hope and my prayer, that even as we cannot be face-to-face in a lot of ways, as we're limited to texts and emails and phone calls and just sort of random seeing people in grocery stores and as we drive by on the road, that you would still remember that God is with you and God extends peace and opportunities to grow even through this season of wilderness and barrenness. So in our times of isolation, the peace of God be with you. Amen.